everybody. Okay, so whoever doesn't know me, my name's Warren Scott Fentress, and by way of so my background is I've got an undergrad in math, physics, and computer science, and actually music. And one of the things I actually made a CD about 10 years ago, and if you want to buy one, it's all instrumental, kind of new agey stuff, and half of that will go back to MUFON to help. I also invented this product called Magnablocks, which I'm trying to bring up on the screen here. And it's not, hold on a second.
You're in play mode.
Hang on. Where is it? Alright, let's go here. So I invented this thing back in 2002. I worked, before I did this, I worked in, when I got out of college, I worked for Hughes Aircraft for about a year on a laser radar system, and then I got into work in Hollywood for 10 years as a software developer and made video games and all this stuff. Anyway, so then I built this product here, and then that's a whole long story, and that's what my book is about. So if you're interested in that, buy my book, which will be done in about 2 months.
Wow.
Okay, so today's topic, now this is going to go really fast, okay? There's a lot of information, your eyes are going to glaze over, we're going to blast through a lot of slides. When I got asked to do this, I'd always pretty familiar with a lot of the concepts, but I went down a rabbit hole like you can't believe. So if you don't have your mind blown, first of all, you've got to realize everything you know, what you've been taught is wrong. Let me give you an example. Who's the first president of the United States? No! John Hanson from Maryland. Washington's the 9th president. He's only the first president after the Constitution was ratified. So everything we've been told since school is kind of, half of it's misinformation. All right, here's what we're going to talk about. This is, like I say, there's a lot of information here. It's going to go pretty quick. So, are UFOs real?
Of course they are.
Of course they are. Anybody denying UFOs is a moron or a disinformation officer. We'll look at history, we'll look at scientific method we're using, how they might work, and some other stuff. Okay, this is what we were promised, right? And to remind you all, I watched this program when I was a kid, and when I was like 5 years old, and I expected this to be the reality. I expected this as our reality. So, 5, 6 years old, I'm watching this, and I'm thinking, gee, by the time I'm an adult, we're going to have anti-gravity cars. And if anybody saw Iron Man or the Avengers, Howard Stark, he shows anti-gravity in the 40s, right? We've had this technology for a long time, but the deep state buried it. All right. I love that theme song. Okay, so this is really what we have today, right? No, it's not that bad. We've got one of these. Don't rear-end it. Remember the grandma? But no, this is, all right, we're getting there, right? We've got some cool cars if you have the money, but this is what exists today. Lilium.com, electric fans. This is being tested right now. You can buy one of these. So we're actually getting pretty close, but this is what we're talking about. By the way, if you want to look, this is the Tester's Bob Lazar model I built very poorly, and we can look at that later. So anyway, are they real? Well, all right, this is Billy Meyer, one of Billy Meyer's photographs. People say, oh, Billy Meyer is a faker. It's like, really? Well, no, we could actually have a guest, this professor down in Columbia I've talked with. He's done some great analysis on all his photographs. I guarantee Billy Meyer's story is real. Look at that. That's another shot from Meyer. That's like either one craft or multiple craft. I don't know. It's pretty impressive. And then another one. So he does have really great photographs of real extraterrestrial vehicles. But we don't need Billy Meyer. These are from the 50s. These are classic photos of real UFOs from other people. That's the Heflin one, right? So anybody who's looking at this stuff, I mean, there's so much evidence. Look at the 52. And I have to wonder, they talk about, well, the Nazis went down to Antarctica, they built UFOs, and some people are conjecturing, well, the Nazis actually won the Second World War because we brought all the scientists over in paperclip, and, they were demonstrating their air superiority in 1952. Or, if they are extraterrestrials, I have to wonder, maybe all this deep state secrecy is because we've actually been conquered, and we don't know it. All right, another one, that's a very interesting cylinder shot, 60 Argentina. Here's one off of... yeah, exactly. Look at that. I mean, these things are incredible. They're not flying objects. They're unidentified, but they don't fly. They levitate and they move beyond flight. It's not flight. There's no flight involved with these things. And we'll talk about that. All right, so who puts these on? You know, who pilots them? Is it one of these guys? Maybe it's that guy. That's a real alien. That's called an emerther, and I think that's the gray from one of the Zeta Reticuli planets. But we have our own astronauts flying up there too. Who built them? Ben Rich, Lockheed. Who commands them, right? That's the real question. Good old Dick, you know, he's worth a million laughs, isn't he? And then what compels these guys? And it's greed. That's why they buried all this stuff, I think, more than anything, the lust for power and greed. And that's the Rothschild's house. That's where they live. They probably own the world. Okay, looking at history, these are 10,000 years old, petroglyphs. They've been seeing flying saucers for 10,000 years or more. The Vimana from the Mahabharata, 5,000-year-old text showing that they had flying machines 5,000 years ago. This is not myth, this is history. Artwork in history, 500 years ago they were drawing flying saucers. Government disclosure has occurred. It's occurred multiple times. It occurred here, and then they buried it. This was in Russia. This, of course, we heard about the recent Tom DeLonge and stuff here, and then who was on the committee, one of the politicians. All right, so that's kind of the backstory, right? Gives you the context of the landscape of. Really, I don't consider any of these unidentified flying objects. I consider them, they're either covert military vehicles or they're extraterrestrial vehicles. And that's really what we're dealing with. They're either non-terrestrial or they're terrestrial covert. And that's, so how do we figure out how these things work? So Newton taught us about gravity. Well, gravity's been around a long time. I love that quote. It's not just a good idea, it's the law. So looking at gravity, nobody really understands gravity well. Maybe Einstein did, but and there's a few physicists I've been reading their papers and looking at some of their presentations, and there's so many theories about even what gravity is. Does anybody know what gravity is? All right, so go ahead.
It's the force that brings people down.
That's a great answer. All right, is it warped space-time? This is what Einstein said, and actually they've proven that gravity does warp space-time. Now, what is space-time? Well, we're going to talk about that. What is warping space-time? We're going to talk about that. But before we get there, and it might be something else too. It might be beyond gravity, and I'm going to explain why that is. So, but they did validate Einstein's theories using this system. Okay, so they've confirmed something called gravitomagnetism. It's been confirmed. This is something that Einstein had postulated, and they've confirmed it. Okay, this is also talking about the relationship between gravity and magnetic fields in physical math. So there's a lot of evidence about that. So in rocket science, which is what we know of now, Newton gave us the law of gravity, where he said, depending on the mass of the object, that the force between the two masses will bring the objects together, right? So what's interesting, we're going to revisit this in a bit, but I don't know if that's actually gravity. It's certainly, it's an effect that we observe, but it may actually be something else. Okay, so this is Newton's laws of motion, which any first-year physics student is going to learn, probably learn about in high school, actually. I'm going to blow through some of this stuff. There's a lot of math on some of these things. And you really need to know this to understand aerospace engineering and ufology. This is not easy stuff, okay? So this shows you some of the things that you got to deal with. Kinematics are like basic ballistic motion, cannonballs and rockets and things. You got to deal with air resistance, something called the drag equation. But to get out of Earth's orbit, you've got to go Mach 33, 25,000 miles per hour. 17,500 will get you to a stable orbit, but if you want to go to the moon or Mars, you have to go 25,000 miles an hour. That's pretty tough, pretty fast. That's about 5 Gs on the human body. Okay, so now this, thanks to Mike on this one. Mike, one of our members here, who worked, was it Pratt, right? And at any rate, he was explaining this about the Mach stuff, because I'm not an aerospace engineer. I was a laser engineer, so I don't know that much about aerospace, so thanks to Mike. But what he had explained is that you can tell how fast these hypersonic and supersonic vehicles go based upon the shape. So it's on the ratio between the wing and the length of the wing, the angle of the wing. So if it's a very wide wing, it's going to be subsonic. And then as the wing gets more delta, it goes supersonic until when it's almost like an arrow, it goes hypersonic. And Mike can actually talk to you about this a lot more. Mike, you want to raise your hand, and if people want to ask you questions specifically about that afterwards. All right, so that's what we know about in the atmosphere. But again, flying saucers don't fly. They're not using any of this stuff because they would melt. I mean, they can't go you can't move through the air like this, okay? So they're doing something completely differently. All right, now going back to what we need to do here in terms of the orbit, if we want to get in orbit, these are some of the equations, and then again, which orbit? Do you want a circular orbit, an elliptical orbit, or do you want to go out into another planet? And if this is the state-of-the-art now of American space rocketry, where's the cursor? Here we go. This is the Orion heavy lift vehicle in 2014 going to Mars. They put something like the LEM is already on Mars. It was launched in 2014. And this is it. The Orion heavy lift vehicle. This is the state-of-the-art of our rocket stuff. This is SpaceX basically, but I think they subcontract to NASA and they call it the Orion, you know. But anyway, you can see this thing. This is a big mother. This is like the best we got going to far orbits. All right, so this is using all Newtonian physics. They don't have to deal with Einstein. They're not going fast enough, really. So this is just brute force getting stuff up into orbit, or in this case, going to Mars. All right, and this is orbital mechanics. So, again, you know, we wanted a deep dive in this. I'm going to kind of skirt through a lot of the math. If you want to talk about that after, we can talk about it after. But it's a little too complicated. But this is just showing you, again, you know, getting out of orbit. You know, 5 Gs at a minimum. That's just going straight up. You know, that's 5 times your weight. So imagine, you know, whatever you weigh and you want to go into orbit, you got to deal with feeling 5 times heavier. And that's not easy on the body. This was the 2001 Mars Odyssey orbit, showing you how that got there. So this is all pretty well understood. Now, when you have heavenly bodies, you have something called Lagrange points, and these are basically parking places in orbit. So I'm mentioning this because if you want to go into the solar system, you've got to be able to communicate with the other vehicles or satellites. You've got to know where everything is. How can you do this? I mean, if here's the Earth and you have a satellite going around the Earth and here's Mars over here, once the satellite's on this side, you can't communicate with your vehicle going to Mars. So you put satellites at the Lagrange points and you've got 24/7 coverage of space. They do it now, what's called astrogation or celestial navigation. They use what's called the Deep Space Network. And this is a bunch of NASA satellites all around the Earth. And that's how we communicate with our long-distance space flights. This is a star map, but space is not flat, and neither is the Earth. And if anybody here believes in a flat Earth, there's the door. Okay. Oh, sorry. Now, and I love this. So there's a great film, Prometheus, if anybody saw it, where they're navigating through space, and they've got this 3D map of like the cosmos. Fabulous, fabulous movie. In order to crunch that kind of data, you need a really big computer. Now, this is in China. It's the biggest computer we have on the world. 93 petaflops. That's 93 kabillion, trillion, wazillion, whatever it is. I don't even know what it is. Crazy. Like, that's the best we have. But look, you need a whole building for that, right? And look how big these things are. So, you know, they figured their computer needs sounded better than ours. Some may call this AI. I call it God for the Galactic Object Database. So others call it Google. All right, so when I was starting to analyze this, I said, let's apply scientific method to as much of this as possible. Let's look at what we observe. Let's get uncontaminated evidence, our data. Let's measure and document it and make sure, like provenance, so much of the stuff you get has no provenance, and you got to reject it because there's no corroboration. Got to validate, corroborate, investigate. We analyze it. Can we model it using known science and math? Can we apply deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning? And then, you know, good old Hegel with the dialectic of you have a hypothesis, antithesis, synthesis. Okay. So when we observe these things, right, what do they look like? Well, they look like they're floating on the sea. Or they're just hovering silently, not moving. They just zip out. The one I saw, and the reason why I joined MUFON is 5 years ago, I saw one of these things, and I saw it go from about 1,000 feet into orbit in about 3 seconds. So there's no way anything that we know about that moves through the atmosphere can do that. You have to move a different way. It is not flight. And also then they cloak themselves. You can have invisibility, and that gets in with bending light, and we'll talk about that. Here's an example of, boy, that picture didn't come out well. This is the Turkey UFO, and this is, I guess, a low-res picture, but you can see here, this is completely cut off, and yet this looks like it's a disc kind of sitting sideways, and it's just been cut off by the... And I believe that that's accomplished by this artificial gravity technology that they're using, if indeed it is gravity, and we're not certain. Okay, so how do they do invisibility, right? So we can actually optically bend light. Now that's a real photo, and this is the optical path, and it creates these cloaked regions. So you can do it optically or mechanically. They don't do it that way. They do it by gravity, is what we presuppose. Now, Einstein is brilliant. Gosh, Einstein, how can you not love this guy? He's like one of my biggest heroes, and just pure thinking. He said, okay, well, these large bodies are actually warping space-time. Now, I meant to bring a piece of foam to show you how this works, but basically the idea is the bigger mass you have, the more that it will sort of bend space-time. And so the light, what happens is if the star is here, right? If the star's there and you look at it, and it's on the side of the sun, it's a straight line, and you can see the star. But what they found is then when the Earth moves position a little bit, the star looks like the star is here, it's gone behind the sun, and yet it still looks like it's here, because the light is bending around the sun according to gravity. Now there's one problem with this. What did Newton say? Two masses, depending on how big the masses are attractive. That's what gravity is. But light has no mass. So how do you bend light if it has no mass for the gravity to act on? All right, there's a problem there. So what's bending is space-time. And that concept I've been trying to get my head around for the longest time, and it's really difficult. What is space-time? We live in it, right? Can you stop time and just have space? You can't. You can't separate them. Because if everybody stops moving, you have to remove time. You're like frozen in time. There's no motion. And motion and time allow us to traverse space. So there's some other operative principle here. And it may be gravity. Maybe that's enough to do it. But I'm not convinced that it's that simple. All right, so here's a lot of the discs have this plasma around them. It looks like it's glowing ball. And that's because it's a high voltage discharge which is causing the air around these things to kind of glow like a fluorescent lamp or a plasma sphere. And actually Tesla figured this out. And when he died, the FBI or the CIA took all his files and classified them. And he actually had a solution for an artificial, ostensibly an artificial gravity technology.
And he invented electricity.
And he invented AC electricity and a whole bunch of other wireless radio and all kinds of stuff.
Before,
now, what's really interesting too about these vehicles is that they have force fields, they have tractor beams, they have all kinds of stuff Star Trek stuff, right? Now, I was looking for a picture that I had seen either in a book, I thought it was a book I had, I couldn't find it, or in a film, and I scoured the web for hours trying to find it. The closest picture I could get is this. Now, this kind of looks like it could be a flying saucer, but that's not, I put this up just to show you. The picture that I saw shows an atomic blast like this, and right here you can see the outline of an Adamski-style flying saucer, which is the kind of hat-looking thing with the three balls underneath. You can really see it in the atomic explosion blast, like it was there monitoring the blast. But I couldn't find that photograph, so I put this one up. Also now you got these huge cylinders, so these things got to weigh, thousands of tons. I mean, these things are huge. They're up to a mile long, and, how are they getting this in the air? And you can see these things actually go from this is coming out of the water. These are Navy photographs, really interesting. And so these huge things come out of the water. So when you have this gravity bubble or the space-time bubble that you can be inside, you can go through anything. I think they can go right through the Earth if they wanted to. And also, with all the vehicles flying around, think of it this way. These things are just like cars. That's all they are. Now, this is a cruise ship, but I mean, the little guys, like the discs, are cars. So, how do they do their traffic when they're zipping around at Mach 700 or faster than light? How do they not collide with each other? Well, maybe the technology is extra-dimensional, and that's how space-time folding works, and they just go through the other object in another dimension, which is another possible technology of how that works. Artificial gravity, right? They've got to nullify the effects of artificial gravity. How can they possibly do that? Well, spin. Spin is everything. You can create a type of gravity just by spinning it. That's how, if you saw 2001, you know, and he's in this big ring, and you know, he's got gravity on the outside because it's turning, and that's how NASA does all of our heavy stuff right now. So everything is spin. This is interesting, a couple of nice animations showing some different kinds of spin fields. This is really interesting. Nassim Haramein came up with this model, and he's a really interesting physicist, and he's modeled what he thinks is the core energy function of how matter exists. That matter isn't real, it's just an energy field that we perceive as something real. And he thinks that this is this. And what's really interesting about this waveform is there was a woman, Lynn Claire Dennis, who had a near-death, she died, and then she was resuscitated. And when she was dead, she saw this wave pattern in her mind, and I read her book, and I saw the drawings she made, and you know what it looks like? It looks like that, which is really interesting. All right, so now we can, this is the rabbit hole. I'm going to blow through this because this is going to go on too long, and it gets pretty intense, but this is the kind of stuff that we're dealing with. So you got to deal with, you know, matter, subatomic particles, kinematics, as we've already talked about that, wave theory, you know, what is gravity, quantum mechanics, and what's quantum entanglement. There's a guy who's got a theory that says gravity is quantum entanglement. Another guy says that it's just the nuclear force that emerges out of the nuclear force that holds electrons and protons together. He says that that same force, that's basically what gravity is, but on the subatomic scale, it's holding the matter together, but as you get further away, it manifests as an emergent phenomenon called gravity. So there's all kinds of ideas about this. Space-time. Now, space-time, we perceive it as a box, right? Height, length, and width. Well, I don't think that that's correct, but that's kind of Euclidean space. And then you have a guy by the name of Minkowski who came up with this idea of space-time being like a manifold, which is, we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then you've got some of these other concepts that we're going to touch on real quick. Again, more specific kind of things. This is stuff I studied in college, and you know, I try to look at that and apply it. But the problem is a lot of the things that we've been taught in school, what did I say at the beginning? Everything you know is wrong. You can't take anything for granted. If you want the truth, you have to find it. You have to look for it. You've got to take multiple sources. So don't be satisfied getting your CNN. You've got to read the paper. You've got to talk to people and so forth to get the truth. All right, anyway, so let's talk a little bit about infinity, because infinity is required for our universe to exist. So really, what is it? It means there's no beginning and no end. So think about that. We didn't start. We've always been here for eternity. All right? I mean, the universe has always existed because it's impossible for it to just come out of nothing. So that's at least the way we understand it. Now you have, and what I love about the yin-yang symbol is that the Chinese kind of had figured out a lot of the important forces in the universe, you know, thousands of years ago. And this is a sine wave. This is like, atoms. This is, you know, it's all kind of tied in here. But now what we're finding is that things are a little more complicated. So when I talk about the Minkowski manifold in the other slide, what you have, these are hyperbolic manifolds. There's surfaces which are not squares or circles or spheres. They're in multiple dimensions. And this, we can't really represent that on a slide, so you've got to kind of imagine this in your mind. But this is like a donut, okay? This is called a Klein bottle, and this is, what's interesting is here is if you start on the outside here, and you go around the outside, and now you come in and you're on the inside. And so in order to do that, you have to have one surface go through another surface. And we can't do that in this world that we know about, unless you go to another dimension, if you add a dimension. There's also this guy, Garrett Lisi, the theory of everything, which is how they try and reconcile like relativity and quantum mechanics. And he came up with this model called the E8 symmetry, and I don't really quite understand this yet, except that's a model for his version of how energy and space-time go together. All right, now let's show, let's see here. This is a really nice, short, about a 3-minute video. Zooming out. This gives you an idea how big the universe is. Those are all galaxies. This is the universe. So to imagine that we're the only life form and that there's not more intelligent people coming here, it's childish. I mean, these numbers are look at the numbers. It's 20 billion light years. It's 100 billion light years. All right, I mean, that's trillions and trillions of stars with trillions of planets. It's so vast, and that's one universe. Some people say there's an infinite number of universes. So, and then, yeah, what about other universes and different laws of gravity? Yeah, that's a cool video just showing the size of that. Now, this is cool. This is a short little. We'll just watch a little bit of this.
4, 5,
This
6, and
is talking about
7-dimensional
dimensions, because we
objects.
think our universe is three-dimensional.
One point has
It's
0
not.
dimensions.
Some people say it's four-dimensional. One dimension is
Double
space-time.
points.
It's not.
And you
I think
have
we're at
one
least 5
dimension.
dimensions at a minimum in this reality. And
Double the
we can
points
talk about that
again.
offline. But this shows you
And
how
two
they
dimensions.
come up with dimensions.
Double the points again, and you have 3 dimensions.
When you get into string theory, they talk about 11 dimensions. Try drawing that.
Double the points yet again, and you have 4 dimensions. Skeptical? You're watching this on a flat 2-dimensional computer monitor. In 2 dimensions, it's not possible to have 3 axes, each of which is 90 degrees to the other 2. Yet we accept this picture as a representation of 3 dimensions displayed on a 2-dimensional monitor. In 3 dimensions, it is not possible to have 4 axes, each of which is 90 degrees to the other 3. Yet as with 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional monitor, we can accept that this is a representation of 4 dimensions. If you remove any one of the 4 axes, you will go back to 3 axes, each of which is 90 degrees to the other 2. Therefore, each of the 4 axes is 90 degrees to each of the other 3. In the same way, we can add a 5th, 6th, or 7th axis, each of which is 90 degrees to all the axes that came before it. Double the points again.
So you can see this gets
And
fairly
we have
complex
5
as you go up into
dimensions.
higher order dimensions, right? I'm going to stop that here just for time. Now, what if that model is wrong? I mean, how do we know? So there was a guy by the name of Buckminster Fuller who you might have heard of. He invented the geodesic dome and a whole lot of other stuff. He came up with what he believed was the correct structure of the universe, and I actually am leaning more towards that model, which is it's a 4-dimensional basic structure with space-time on top of it, which is how I get to 5 dimensions as a minimum for how we live. And that's a big, long conversation. We can talk about that offline. But out of what's interesting is what he did is he said, okay, everything is based upon a sphere or a circle, which is a planar representation of a sphere. And I agree. I think our universe is all spheres. At a fundamental level, we're just bubbles. And if you put a bunch of spheres together and line them up and move it into 3 dimensions, you get this shape here. It's a tetrahedral axis. And if you shine a light on it and you get this pattern, this is called the flower of life, which is an ancient Sanskrit model for what they believe how the universe works. And then Stephen Wolfram, you may have heard of. He's a very well-known scientist, mathematician. So he was taking this idea and modeling space-time with different types of topologies. So what this really looks like is space-time looks like a sponge. And keep that in mind when we talk about bending space, okay? Think of it as a sponge. Of course, it's not a real sponge. It has a spongy shape, but it's just energy, so it's not actually solid, I think, in the end. All right, I'm going to touch on just a couple other concepts here. So waveforms, wave motion on the ocean, or the Earth has a magnetosphere, which is this magnetic gravitational field. And when you see the saucers, sometimes when they're not really hovering, but they're kind of just floating around like this, it looks like they're riding a wave. And I think that's what we've been figured out, is that they're riding the magnetosphere of the Earth. This is harmonics. Basically, this is, I think, very interesting material that shows how you can take these waves and stack them up together and you can get different shapes out of them. This is correlating the 12-tone musical scale to sacred geometry. And the reason why I'm touching on this too is because I think that harmonics and resonance is how everything manifests in the universe. Resonance, basically, this is the idea of you can take and you can vibrate something at a particular frequency and amplitude, as how strong it is. And if that vibrational frequency is an integer multiple of the natural vibrational frequency of what you're vibrating, you get huge amplification. And this is manifest in what's called the Washington Narrows Bridge collapse. They didn't realize that the wind was at a harmonic frequency to the bridge that they built. Okay? Now look at what this bridge does. This is resonance, harmonic resonance. Look at the power of what this can do. It's just, they built this thing the wrong way. That's all they did. They didn't think about the resonant frequency. Look at that, cement and steel. Cement and steel. That's pretty amazing, right? And anyway, we can watch it collapse if you want us.
Yeah,
17 inches thick of steel cables holding this thing up, right? I mean, look at that. Huge deflection. That's a massive amount of power going through there. And just from the wind.
vibration from the wind.
Vibration from the wind, right. Look at that, 30 feet concrete and steel bending. Imagine driving on it when it starts to...
Did that guy make it out of the car?
Yeah, he got it, yeah. No, actually, it was the scientist measuring the deflection. So. I saw this back in high school. They had a longer version of it back then. But yeah, this is a scientist. He's saying, okay, it wasn't really like that. That was like a day before it collapsed, but just, make it dramatic.
Will he heed the last warning or perish with the doomed structure?
Hope he has progressive insurance.
Work it, work it. Make it exciting.
Keep in mind with your theory on vibration, though, when you reach absolute zero, and things aren't moving, there's no vibration.
Right, absolutely, yeah. That's what happens. And then, here we go. Just because it's kind of cool here. Sayonara. Kaboom. Right, so resonance, beautiful thing. All right. So let's go from resonance now. It's a wave motion. So all right, let's talk about light. So everybody know what light is, right? Nobody knows what light is.
We have an idea, right?
Exactly, that's a light bulb, right? So photons are energy fields that come from from whatever's emitting light, and these fields radiate out in what's called a wave-particle duality, a quanta of something that's energy that has both wave aspects and particle aspects, and it's very, very interesting. And this is like a whole presentation unto itself, but. This is surface matter, surface waves. This takes the idea of a waveform and maps it on a sphere. And a lot of guys like Schrodinger and and Einstein and some of these other guys think that this is kind of energy on its subatomic level will have a surface that kind of looks like that. This interesting cymatics is this guy Hans Jenny, who looked at a lot of different frequencies and materials, and he imaged that to see what those frequencies would generate. And right here, these are musical pitches. It's an octave scale, and each one creates kind of a unique harmonic pattern. And that's quite interesting. So I think that gives us a key that the fundamental particles of what we are harmonic in nature. So I want you to keep that in mind. Harmonics, which is waveforms, right? And energy is matter. This is another picture of some ideas of how fundamental particles, electrons, protons, or hadrons, leptons, quarks, so forth, may actually go together. This is just showing you how they've taken this model of protons and neutrons and said, no, they're actually made up of smaller particles called quarks. Each quark has either 2 up quarks and 1 down quark, or 2 down quarks and 1 up quark. One of the guys that we interviewed on the UFO show, Rick Crandall, has an idea that's really quite profound that actually reduces these even further to just 2 common pieces, which is really interesting. And then you get into quantum entanglement, and there's what's called spooky action at a distance. If you want to look at this slide, it tries to explain what this is, but the idea is you can take basically like a photon from a laser or whatever, and you can split it into 2 halves, and you polarize them so one's up and the other one's down, and then you can just keep that one photon here and let the other photon go as far across the universe as you want. And if you want to change this photon, the other one changes instantly. And they don't quite yet, they call it spooky action at a distance. It's really freaky. I think really what happens is that, it gets into this thing like this guy Heisenberg, who talked about the uncertainty principle and how you can measure something's momentum and then you don't know its position, or you can measure its position and you don't know its momentum, and by the act of actually observing this stuff changes its state. So this opens up a lot of cans of worms when you get into quantum entanglement. But Einstein, which again he called it spooky action at a distance, but he thought that there was a lot of validity to it. Now, Einstein wouldn't have gotten anywhere without this guy Lorentz, and this was really interesting. I remember this in like differential equations in college that, when I saw this stuff, I thought, oh, well, what's the big deal with Einstein? Because Lorentz already worked it all out. And basically what he's saying is that anything that exists can only exist in relationship to something else. If you put a ball this big in an empty universe, you have no idea how big it is, because there's nothing in reference to it. It could be very big, far away, or it could be very small, very close. So you have to have what's called the initial frame of reference, and then you have an inertial frame of reference, which is the other particle as it's moving in relation to what's called the observer. And this is what Einstein used to work out relativity. He used this exact math equation to work out relativity. So, relativity, right? And again, this is, what did they say? I can't remember the joke, something about it's all relative, but so he theorized first what's called the special theory of relativity, and then he came up with the general theory. And he said that as you go to the speed of light, you get this paradox where, what happens is someone's on Earth, and then someone goes in a rocket ship, and they zip off at near the speed of light, and they say time moves differently for those 2 people, and they've actually proven this. So the faster you go, the slower time moves for you. In relation to someone looking at you, for you, the time feels the same. But for somebody looking at you, if you're moving really fast, they're going to perceive your time moving slower than their time. And what happens is, there's the twin paradox. I say, well, if you could go the speed of light, there's problems with that because it requires infinite energy, which you can't really get. And then with the time factor, if you're moving at these kinds of speeds, that you can send the twin. You can send your twin to Alpha Centauri. When he comes back, you've aged 70 years and they've aged 4 years, and it just opens up a lot of causality problems. Like they talk about going back in time to kill yourself, and then how do you go back in time to kill yourself because you weren't born because you killed yourself, right? It's like it opens up these causality problems. Which we'll talk about here a little bit further. This is some other advanced math that you have to know. Maxwell's equations is electromagnetic energy. Schrodinger is the atom. You've got the Einstein field equation, this Bekenstein-Hawking equation. So it's pretty advanced. And then, stuff like fractals, and I want to show you fractals, and then phi is really interesting because nature all works according to what's called the phi ratio. And again, this gets pretty deep. I'm going to blast through this so we can look at fractals. So I believe that, the universe is fractal. I think maybe time or space-time may be fractal. So what happens is you just take one shape and then you replicate it at a smaller value, and then it moves all around, and you can keep going. And what's really interesting about that, let me run that again. What's really cool about this is that you have, let me see here, where's play? Okay. So there's one sphere. Now you get smaller spheres that they happen to place in these locations, and then smaller again, and smaller again, smaller again. Now, you'd think at some point the sphere just is so small that it's not going to exist, right? But no, it turns out, and this is a math thing, that the distance between 1 and 2 is infinite. This has been proven mathematically that you can go from 1.0000000 trillion zeros, and then you can try to get to 2, and you'll never get there. It's infinite. And that's what fractals tell us, that the universe is made up of stuff that's infinite. Now, has anybody ever seen this island before? In their travels? Well, no, because it's fractal. This is a computer program, and it's all done fractally. So it looks just like a real thing. So our world is based on fractals. Okay, so now that's kind of a big background of some of the things that you've got to kind of juggle in your head to try to understand the way UFOs work. And so what we've called it right now is like artificial gravity, is how we think these things may fly. And you have different kinds of artificial gravity, what's called electrogravitic and magnetogravitic. And also through time you've had all these theorists that have come up with different ideas of how anti-gravity can work. So these are kind of the big names in the... There's your buddy Stan Friedman. He likes the nuclear rocket, which is this insane idea that's so retarded. I don't know how they ever thought of it, where they would blow up nuclear bombs every second for 5 years or whatever to get the thing up to halfway the speed of light. I mean, it's just absurd, but I heard Stan talk about that one time. That's kind of interesting. But anyway, so if you want to look up some of these guys, and I can make this PowerPoint available if you want to look through it, but and these guys go off into their particular theories. I think some of them are a bit silly, but you do have, like this guy, T. Townsend Brown, there's something called the Brown Byfield effect, which they use on the stealth bomber and the stealth fighter. And that's kind of an electrogravitic effect, but it's not very much. It's not going to levitate the aircraft, but it does help improve its performance. So electrogravitics, all right, so this is the idea of creating a high voltage electric field around the object that you're dealing with. And then by changing, where the power is, you can change the shape of the field, and then that's how the thing can move. And it's going to work in concert with the magnetosphere. Then you have gravitomagnetics. So you have electrogravitic, and then you have gravitomagnetic, or magnetogravitic, or there's different ways of calling it. And this shows you a couple of ways of how the magnetic field works around a particular object. Notice that this is a ring, and so the disc and ring shapes are very popular because I guess that's the easiest way to create the magnetic fields, by using a high voltage electrostatic discharge. Here's another picture I found, and this is showing, I think this is totally wrong, but just to show you kind of the plethora of information that we have. And this is showing you here, this is an Adamski style craft, and these are the 3 pods underneath that generate these fields ostensibly, and they're saying that it's an ion plasma vortex. Let's say, I can't even read that, but so this is like one guy's theory of how this works, of how those might work. This is a confusogram. All right, so then these are a few ideas. All right, so there's this artificial gravity we need, but how does that help us? Well, if gravity says that that's going to fall, we have to negate gravity, and we do it with flight by the force of lift with the wing. So these are not flying vehicles, so they don't use any lift, so they're nullifying the gravity of the Earth somehow. And there might be multiple techniques to doing this, but we talked about gravity as being warping space-time, right? So what is space-time and how might it be shaped? And here's a couple of other images of trying to represent space-time. So the reality is these things don't use rockets or conventional tech. They have to bend space-time. It's inertialess, which means if you're moving, you build up an energy. And so like if you've ever been in a car accident, and then you'd be moving 5 miles an hour and you hit something and it feels like somebody clobbered you on the head with a hammer, that's because of your inertia. So it's real dangerous. Inertia is what kills the pilots. That's G-forces. In a plane crash, it's the inertia that's killing you. So they have to move without inertia. And again, it may be artificial gravity that's doing it. Now, there's been a couple of researchers, Hal Puthoff and Miguel Alcubierre, and they came up with this idea of this bent space-time manifold. It's a surface here, and it's basically like Star Trek warping. They're warping space, and they're able to push these things along, and that's what that sort of looks like. Now, NASA's been tagging this thing called an EM drive, or an M drive. And what I find so interesting about this is you've got Puthoff and Alcubierre talking about how you really do it, and then NASA comes out with this, and they're saying, well, we put this thing up here, it's just an electric motor, and in about a year or two we can get you up to halfway the speed of light or whatever. They're still pushing stuff. Now they're pushing it through space so you don't have drag from the atmosphere, but I mean this is not the way to travel in space. Okay, that's definitely the wrong way to do it. So, getting back to Alcubierre here, the craft creates this warped bubble, if you will, this space-time bent shape, which basically is pushing it outside of our reality. It may be moving into a higher dimension, which, again, when we saw the dimension video, it's kind of hard to get your head around what that is. So, this is kind of a picture they talked about how it may work and how it's stretching space-time. And keep that in mind, because when we talk about Bob Lazar, we're going to need to know that. That's the model for the space-time thing. This is, let's see, is this a video? No. This is a video. Okay, so check this out. Oh, wait, no. Not that one. Again, another picture of warping space. This is the video. All right, how do we visualize going faster than light?
This is in the first one.
Now, what's interesting, so when I worked in Hollywood, I worked at Paramount Pictures during the production of Star Trek Next Generation. I've met all those people. I've been on the set. I sat in Captain Picard's chair and went, engage. And ask me my Patrick Stewart story, and I'll tell you after. But anyway, what's interesting about this is that they talk about the films being kind of partial disclosure, like Close Encounters was the 54 Holloman contact, Holloman Air Force Base, when the Earthers came and tried to get us to get rid of nuclear weapons. And so, you have these kind of semi-info releases. So what's interesting about this, you can see the way that their warp animation gets better as the technology, the computer graphic technology gets better. But, the sound effects, well, there's no sound in space. I mean, it's so Hollywood, it's pretty funny. But do you see the way the thing bends? The engines get longer. So that's called length. Well, actually, it's supposed to be, they should get shorter, because when you go fast, when you start going to the speed of light, you get what's called length contraction and time dilation. But what they're showing there is the engines are elongating, but they're supposed to be getting smaller, so they kind of screwed that up when they made the model. Maybe it looks better that way. Okay, now, this is where I personally believe this guy, and I think that he's telling absolutely the truth from what our government's been doing with secret captured ET technology and reverse engineering. I really believe this guy 100%. Now, some of the information he gives came from briefing booklets, so maybe some of that information isn't correct, but I suspect I would say probably 95% of this guy's story is true. So, first of all, and it's true because the government tried to shut this guy down. They took away all of the records of his education, of his work history, but he had physical proof. And there was a guy by the name of Robert Krangle who worked with him at Los Alamos who came forward and said, yeah, he was a physicist at Los Alamos, just like he said. And if you look at Lazar's story, everything makes sense why Teller hired him. He was a brilliant kid. He built a cyclotron, an atom smasher in his backyard. He built this rocket car by the time he was like 23. This kid was a genius, and they said, we need somebody smart to reverse engineer the ET technology. Maybe this guy can do it. Now, what Lazar says, there were only 22 people working at S4 on the saucer, and they were all compartmentalized. So, and he said, you can't make scientific progress without collaboration. You got to work with everybody in a team. You got to disseminate the information. But military programs don't work that way. They're compartmentalized. And so you had him and his partner worked on the propulsion system, and then other guys worked on the navigation, and two other guys worked on so they couldn't talk to each other. It was against their national security oath to even talk to their colleagues. I mean, it's insane why they set it up this way, but the paranoia of the national security state is what drove this all underground, and the greed of the people involved. But at any rate, so what he says, and again, I think this is probably close to the truth, although I don't think it's 100% correct, but he says that they bend space-time using an amplified artificial gravity that comes naturally out of this element 115. Now, element 115, like, uranium is 92, okay? And then you get these higher element number elements, and they don't exist naturally on the Earth. Okay, so he talked about this in 1989, and 15 years later, Los Alamos says, "Hey, we synthesized 115." So he was right about 115 being a viable thing. And they tried to debunk him on that. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But anyway, this is the sport model saucer here. And there's this reactor here, and what they do is they take a little triangular piece of element 115 and they drop it in this reactor. By the way, this reactor, which powers the vehicle, that allows it to go faster than light and everything else, the little piece of 115 about yay big powers the thing. And that reactor, he said, was about this big. I mean, it's tiny. It would solve all our energy problems. I mean, that's why they don't want to release this, to put the oil cabal out of business, right? All right, and then these things here are called the gravity amplifiers. So what he said is that 115 is naturally anti-gravity. Imagine if you saw the movie Avatar, and they went to Pandora, and they have those floating mountains. So imagine if they were made out of 115, that's what you would have. Because they have a natural anti-gravity field, is what Lazar said. And then they take that and they wave shape it, they wave guide it through these guys, and they're able to then create this gravity field, this bubble. And by the way, also too, he said element 115, which does not occur naturally on the Earth, does occur naturally on binary star systems. Alpha Centauri, Beta Centauri, Proxima Centauri, it's actually 3 here, but Zeta Reticuli is 2 stars, and that's where they said these guys came from. So Zeta Reticuli, A and B, binary star, they're going to have element 115 there, and that's why they were able to create these vehicles, certainly sooner than we've been able to. Here's element 115. Now, a lot of the debunkers say, oh, 115 is unstable. It's like uranium's unstable. It decays, and plutonium is unstable. It decays. Well, they're wrong about that, and Lazar's right. They're isotopes, which means that if you have an atom and it's 115 protons and neutrons in the center, and you can have different numbers of electrons on the shell, and you can create what's called an isotope. And what he said is that what they do is they bombard 115 with a proton, they turn it into 116, and that creates what's called an island of stability. And this is actually, from Los Alamos here, so they've mapped out what this island of stability is, and what he says is that all the people that say 115 is unstable, well, they're just lying to you, because there's an isotope that is stable. And in fact, that's what the physics tells us. I mean, when you look at any isotope, you can make unstable ones and you can make stable ones. So that's again why I think Lazar's telling the truth. This is a bit closer, the way it works. So he said, here's the waveguide. You put this 115 in here, and then somehow this reactor, it's kind of complicated. He talks about it generates, it's an matter-antimatter collision. I'm not sure that that's actually what's happening. I don't think it's matter-antimatter. It could be, but the problem with matter-antimatter is piece of matter here, piece of antimatter here. When you put them together, huge energy. It's all converted to energy, and you'd get something that would be about 1,000 hydrogen bombs. It's something you don't want to mess around with. So I really doubt that's what's happening. But at any rate, a little bit closer here. So this shows you how these wave amplifiers move. And so they take the artificial gravity, and you can see here, this pole goes up here, so this gravity field is going all around the outside of the craft. And the disc shape just happens to be very easy to deal with when you're putting a field around something. I think that they're not all disc shaped, not all UFO vehicles are disc shaped, but I just think, again, this is a car, this is a Kia, it's a Hyundai, it's an alien Hyundai. They're not going to give you like all the bells and whistles, they just want to give you a little vehicle that you can go from the mothership down to the planet with. I mean, they're not really that concerned with putting all the bells and whistles in it, at least that's the way I look at it. He's mentioned that there's 2 modes of operation. There's the Omicron mode, which is where it's hovering on the magnetosphere, and you have one amplifier pointed down, interacting with the magnetosphere, and then these amplifiers here allow it to move back and forth. So it's levitating on one, and it's just, they're making little gravity pulls to move the thing around so they can control it. But when you go into delta mode, this is where you get faster than light space-time bending. The 3 waves converge, and they're able to pull space over here this way. So it's easier to pull space onto you than it is to move the vehicle through space. So they pull the space in, and then now the flying saucer, it's in 2 spaces at once, right? So here's the flying saucer. And you notice a lot of flying saucers do this before they leave, okay? So the amplifiers are now pointed this way, and they converge and they create a point here and they pull the space here and then they release it and boom, it's here in 0 time, and literally in 0 time. So what they do is to go really far distances, you cascade that. So you go, all right, I'm going to bend this space-time here, I'm going to come, you know, I'm going to bend this space-time here, boom, I'm here, I'm going to bend this space-time here, boom, I'm here. And that's how they probably move. That's what I believe. I can't prove it, of course.
Is that at a 45-degree angle because of where dimensions are at 90s?
Well, the amplifiers are pointing straight down. Now, they can vector them, right? But when you have the 3 amplifiers together in this delta configuration, it's resonance. You've got to have the 3 all together so that you can pull space-time to you. When it's just one holding it up and the 2 are pointed this way to allow it to move back and forth, it's not going faster than light. I don't think it's really bending space-time. It's just using magnetic fields or gravity fields, rather, to move the thing around. So they turn up like this because if you want to go up into space, you want the 3 amplifiers pointed to where you're going. And it doesn't matter that it's flying this way because when you're bending space-time, when you're inside this thing, who saw Arrival? The movie Arrival? All right, great. Go see this movie. There's a scene in there. This shape is sitting up like this. They go into the opening, and the next thing you know, they jump, and they jump 90 degrees, and now they're standing straight up. So they're perceiving the gravity to be like this, but they're actually like this. Same thing in these vehicles. If you're sitting in this thing, it doesn't matter how it's oriented. You're always just sitting in it like it's here, just like this. No difference. So you can be going faster than light, and you're not going to perceive any motion at all, because to you, you're not moving. The space-time is moving, but the vehicle isn't. All right, it's really a strange concept to get around. So here's again trying to show you how you bend space-time. Like you pull the space from here, you pull the space-time onto the craft, and then you release it, and boom, the craft is going to be right there. Just a little more detail. This is element 115. Goes into the reactor here, then it creates this artificial gravity wave, then this amplifies it, and then they're able to vector it. Now this is showing you these waveforms, so there may be some frequency component involved. So the higher frequency, maybe it could go further in space, or it's unknown to me, but this is just showing a little bit more of the detail here. And again, this is such a deep subject. I mean, I spent the last couple of months, working on this off and on, and it's such a rabbit hole. I was like, how do you explain this stuff if you don't have the physics background? So you got to understand that there's a lot involved with this. It's not trivial. And even for somebody like me, I got my undergrad in '85. I did grad school in '90 and again in 2008. So I just, with all the information I have, and I don't even understand half of it, right? So I understand. Granted, this is very tricky. Now, a lot of people try to debunk Lazar, and so is his story true, right? So I made these points before. Well, one of the things I'm curious about, why do binary stars only make element 115, right? And he tries to explain that in one of the interviews that he gives, and I don't really understand why binary stars can create element 115, but that's what he read in the briefing paper at S4. Again, he announced 115. It was at least I think it was 5 years before they discovered it. I don't remember. I looked it up. I think they discovered it in '95, so I think it was about 5 years. And if it's disinformation, if you think Lazar's lying and if it's disinformation, well, what they talk about a lot, and if you've seen the film Roswell, there's a great quote in there where he says, well, it's the majority 12 guys are together, and they say, well, leaks won't hurt us. Some of the truth comes out. It'll be okay if we have some well-placed disinformation, right? So that's what they've been doing, is trying to muddy the waters so we can't figure out really what's going on. There was an aerospace draftsman named Mark McCandlish, who was hired to draw a picture of a CAD drawing, a computer-aided drawing, of what's called the Alien Reproduction Vehicle, or the Flux Liner. And you can look this up offline. I've spoken with Mark. He's a really good guy. He's very friendly. We might be able to get him to speak, Mike. He's a good guy. Anyway, so this is showing you they got oxygen tanks, and here's the pilot seats, and I think this was an attempt to do just a purely electrogravitic system, not necessarily one of these that's using 115, but I don't really have enough information. This is just another picture of how it goes together. Now, this technology, so when they started building this, so what I've heard and what's alleged, and I don't know that this is true, but the next generation of these things, right? So Lazar was at S4 in like 89, 88 and 89. And he said, oh, there's no way we can reverse engineer these things. It's like taking an iPhone back to the Civil War and saying, I need 100 of these. Like they'd be scratching heads for 100 years. I wouldn't be able to do it. They don't have the technology. And he says, well, that's the same case with the technology and these guys. But we know that there's been all of this experimentation with artificial gravity with the Nazis and so forth, that maybe we do actually have the capability, and maybe just Lazar was looking at a more advanced version. It's like, that's the electric car, and this is the gas car. You know, it's just an easier, it might have been an easier technology. And this is called the Yukon. So that's one of our first kind of production flying saucers. This is another picture here of showing you how the fields might work. I don't know why I put that slide in there. Let's pass. Okay, so when you bend space-time, what is happening, right? How does it work? And there's this idea of wormholes or stargates and portals that you might have heard about. And it's probably the same kind of technology. Now, some people allege they're natural portals. I don't know if that's true. But if we can bend space-time with one of these guys, then we could certainly have a portal. We could bend space-time, for example, from El Segundo, California to Mars. And there's an alleged jump room in El Segundo, California and other places where they can actually they jump through this big magnet and boom, they're on Mars. And that's kind of sort of what it would look like. Now, when you talk about bending space-time in a wormhole, if you want to go, this is where I had a piece of foam. Somebody have a piece of paper I can borrow and I can kind of jump out. Let me use this. Okay, so let's say you're here with your flying saucer and you want to go here. Now, shortest distance between two lines, between 2 points is a straight line, right? But not in space-time, because if it's multidimensional, you can bend it. So you bend the space-time like this, and then boom, there's no distance to travel, and that's the shortest distance, bending space-time. So this is kind of showing you how that particularly works. This is another, oh yeah, this is the toroidal space-time bubble. So again, when you're in one of these vehicles, everything around you, you're in your own like universe, okay? You're in your own reality, if you will, because, you know, we don't see these things very often. And when they do show up in our planet, they're not moving at faster than light travel, because we wouldn't see them. But what happens is when you're on these things, and again, think of it like this, like on the Earth right now, we're not moving in here, right? We're all just sitting here. But the fact is the Earth is rotating at like, 30,000 miles an hour, and then it's going around the sun at about 1,000,000 miles an hour. I calculated this out, and I don't remember the numbers. And then the galaxy is turning. So when you add up all these vectors, we're actually moving so fast right now that if you really thought about it, like how come we're not being blown off the Earth? I mean, we're literally, we're moving too fast, you'd think. And that's the way sort of gravity works, is that, there's local gravity and then there's kind of cosmic gravity. Or cosmic space-time. And so what happens is we don't notice any motion here. And this has been proven time and time again. If you're on a jet, right, you're going 600 miles an hour and you throw your pen up and you can catch it, right? If you throw it up, you think, I'm going 600 miles an hour, my pen isn't, it's going to fly back there. But no, that's not the way these forces work. So you can kind of try and get into all this stuff, and it's pretty understandable. But when you start looking at this to say, okay, they've created this bubble of space-time which is outside of our space-time. So if a flying saucer is going this way, and here's another flying saucer, they may actually be able to go right through one another, and that's what's really bizarre. And I haven't wrapped my head around that one yet, but it's this idea of this completely unique space-time that's sort of a dimension above ours, or they're moving outside of this reality. One way, shape, or form. And there's definitely multiple ways of doing this. Now, this is a nice computer model of what it might look like to observe something moving through bending space-time. Now, that's what we perceive. Now, does that ball actually squeeze out like that? It can't, because if you're in that, you're going to be squished, right? So what's happening is we perceive it looks like that, but in fact all that's happened is the ball it was in two space-times and it went from one to the other. Here's another animation that shows a black hole moving through space-time. And the reason why I believe space-time warping is how this works is because, again, gravity requires mass, and light has no mass. So if we can bend light, we have to be bending it not using, it's not a gravity bend, although gravity seems to bend light. It's gravity bends space-time, and light traveling through space-time is going to go where the space-time is. Yeah, it's crazy. All right, anyway, that's going through a black hole. Now, to show you this, this is what I saw. Now, this is not my video, but this is basically what I saw. Okay, 5 years ago, I saw,
in slow motion.
not this first part, the second shot, just to see first, see a few things. This is what I saw.
Strange object.
Look at it, it's just gone. It's just gone, right?
In slow motion, the camera records a small silver streak of instant acceleration.
We don't have this type of capability for propulsion technology.
Look at that. And they try to say Billy Meyer, oh, he edited the film.
We showed
Why do we not believe Billy Meyer, but we believe all these other guys? It's, you know, they've debunked Billy Meyer because he had such a good case. Anybody who gets debunked that hard is legitimate. All right, here's this Alcubierre ship again. I just love the shape of that, the design of that. This is the Yukon again, in flight. Now, this is kind of the state-of-the-art of our secret space program. I did a presentation on this a couple months ago. And you can see, you know, we're using rockets and wings. I mean, you know, why are we wasting our money with this when Lockheed has this other technology? Write your congressman. Get these politicians to either shape up or vote them all out. They're all criminals and bums. This is a triangular ship that's docked at the ISS. All right, what's that?
That was a live feed too. For
Yeah.
stuff. And then they took it off.
And they cut it, so obviously it's real. So that's a real. Is it extraterrestrial? Is it an NTV, a non-terrestrial vehicle? Is it a CV, a CMV, a covert military vehicle? One or the other. Can only be. And there's that's probably ours. Okay, so looking at this, like I said, disclosure has already occurred. And no one's making a big deal about it because the way they soft pedal it, you know, this whole Tom DeLonge thing, right? What an interesting release that was. But, you know, like I showed you, you know, the Army's already, the Air Force already said that they're real, and then they retracted, right? So we really need to end the secrecy because we're not going anywhere until we do. And this is the real problem. And really, these guys warmongering, and aliens, they wanted to take over, unless they've already conquered us. This is a ridiculous fear. I mean, they could blow us away so easily. We're no threat to them, so, you know, they don't, to me, it makes no sense. So anyway, this is just the different types here. And there's this idea of subterranean advanced civilizations, the Agarthans or the Athenians and the Atlanteans and whatever. Yeah, maybe that's true or not, I don't know. I suspect there may be some underground bases and so forth. But I don't think that's the only place they come from. I mean, I believe that these are absolutely extraterrestrial or non-terrestrial. And they're basically tourists. These ships that come into our galaxy, they are cruise ships, and these people come down and they're explorers, and they look at the humans in the zoo. Let's go get some of their kiwi fruit. Let's, or they're scientists. Like, what are these creatures here? Some people believe that the extraterrestrials have genetically engineered us, and I agree. I don't think we evolved here. I think we're a hybrid of indigenous life and extraterrestrials, and I think they've been involved with us for thousands of years, and they're tweaking. That's why there's no missing link in anthropology. They're like, how do we go from Neanderthal to Homo erectus, or Homo erectus to Homo sapien, whatever it is? It's like, well, genetic engineering answers that. And again, or we've been conquered, and that's the real secret the government wants to keep us aware of. So, what we need to do is we need to convert the military-industrial complex to a deep space exploration and Terran sustainability. I mean, who saw the Thunderbirds when they were a kid? International rescue. This guy, some rich guy, has this island with all this high-tech rockets and space stuff, and anytime there's a disaster in the world, boom, they're first on scene and they save everybody. Like, why don't we think like this? Why are we at war? And it's these crazy bastards selling us weapons. We got to get rid of all of these guys. We need exobiologists and archaeologists and linguists and people that let's understand who these creatures are. They're sentient beings just like every one of us. Who cares if they're blue, green, black, yellow? We got to get rid of our xenophobia. And that's why I despise Trump, honestly. I'm sorry to make a political statement here, but this guy's xenophobia I mean, he's trying to like make non-white people, immigrants, like bad for some reason. I'm like, what a moron.
If you're reptilian.
Yeah, don't get me started on that. So this idea, we want to visualize, verbalize, and vitalize the truth so that we can get into the greater galactic community. So in the end, these things work by several technologies most likely. There's probably multiple technologies. Electrogravitic, gravitomagnetic, maybe antimatter, this element 115 could be that. You know, that's kind of the power plant behind these things. We got to get rid of the national security state. It's killing us. We're wasting our money, and it's turning this place into pre-Nazi Germany. I mean, it's really scary right now. So, anyway, I don't care how they work.
I want one.
I want one.
Yeah.
Right? Princess Amidala, right? I want her space. That was a Maserati right there.
That's a Cadillac.
Yeah, exactly. Boom. So let's go to light speed, and I'll take what I can get. So this is when I was at the space shuttle back in about 10 years ago when I met John Blaha. So there you go.
Yay!
A lot of slides, sorry, but if you have any questions, I'd be glad
Can you
to
send that slide to us?
try and answer.
That presentation?
You know, I'll make it available like on my Facebook page or through MUFON or something like that. It's a very large file, so it might be really hard to download.
Okay.
But if you want a copy of it, I can make a PDF of it maybe, and give me your email address.
I wish I had a memory stick with me. I would have brought one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I'll have my, you know, I mean, next month I can give you the, you can do it that way too. So,
Outstanding.
yeah.
One of the interesting things, Warren, you know, in relation to the power systems that are on these ships,
Right.
is how do these aliens control that power? In other words, how do they make it go this way, that way?
Right. Okay, so if you think of a nuclear reactor, the way a nuclear reactor works, right, is that you have your fissionable material, your uranium or plutonium or what have you, right? And they have things called control rods, and a control rod basically you can put more energy into the system or you can take it out. And the control rod basically is a volume control of the power, right? So it's probably a lot, if it's a 115 system, and and they have this little piece of 115 as a triangle in this thing, there's got to be a way where there's something interacting with it, a field or some kind of mechanical thing or whatever that allows them to increase the gain or to reduce the gain, and that gives the general gravity field. And then, like I showed in the Lazar model, the artificial gravity field is generated in the reactor, and then a waveguide is a pipe. Basically, a waveguide is just a pipe for like electromagnetic or gravitomagnetic energy, and they direct those into the gravity wave. Well, he calls them amplifiers. I think they're really more like vector controls, so that the gravity comes in and okay, so it gets amplified, and then they can pivot that thing around. So really, just by directionally moving that intense gravity field, that's how they control.
There's some indication from the Roswell crash that these beings were actually able to, through some sort of headset that they wore,
right,
to actually control the ships by their thought.
Right, and then what's interesting about that, I mean, I think that also I read too that there was a panel that had a hand on it with like 6 fingers, right, and they can control it that way. But right, the idea of the thought interface, what's really fascinating, actually I should have included that because about a couple of years ago when I was looking into that, 2 really, really interesting things came out in the public press. One is that they've been able to capture your brainwave, and you can think of a number and they can read it. Mm-hmm. So if you can read a number from your mind, you're going to be able to read just about anything. And what they have now in like the advanced craft, like the stealth and so forth, what I've heard is in the heads-up display that they are starting to do this with the targeting and so forth, and that what I read was that these electronics are so sensitive, like if you go in and you've had too much coffee or you're taking a sedative or something, they're not going to work because your thoughts, your consciousness is kind of messed up, right? So you have to be, the reason why too these creatures are so much more advanced than us is not just purely from the math and science, but they're able to really control their thinking in a way that most of us can't. I mean, I've been meditating for 40 years, and I got to tell you, it's still as hard today as it was 40 years ago. Controlling your thought and just staying focused on something. But allegedly, with the neural interface is what they call that they think of where they want to go, the computer, the craft reads it, boom, they're there.
Like the Clint Eastwood movie. What was that called?
Right,
Yeah.
Skyfox.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Firefox.
Firefox, right, Firefox. Yeah. And they have that tech. I mean, that was a disclosure too, in a way,
Just
right?
remember, a computer used to be the size of this room in order to calculate 1 + 1.
Right now, it's just
You know, give us 10, 50, 100 years, whatever.
right.
And the capacity and capability of what we'll be able to do is just it's off the chart. But we're not there yet. The world's still flat.
Yeah, we're still waiting for the quantum to
We need some time. Did you see what he has in his wallet? Did you get a chance to see what he has in his wallet?
Who?
You need to tell
This
him the
could be
story.
element 115 right here.
Tell him the story.
Yeah, Chris, who...
Yeah, it's a guitar pick.
element one.
No, Chris.
That looks like what it would be, right? That's kind of the shape
Yeah.
of it. Yeah. That's what they put in the
No,
reactor.
Chris, do you ever meet Chris? He shows up once in a while at our meetings.
Probably. I'm not
yeah.
sure
Anyway,
which one he is, but yeah.
he has had all kinds of interactions with UFOs, and his whole life has been interacting with UFOs.
Wow.
This guy is strange, kind of a strange character, but interesting. And he told me that one day one was hovering over him and dropped several of these from the ship onto the ground.
That might be a spent one.
I
should have brought my Geiger counter. We could have checked it out.
radioactive.
Well, he claims it's not radioactive, but I'm not going to carry it in my wallet anymore. Anyway, so I just thought I'd show you.
You don't want any children, I hope.
Yeah, I want to have a lot more kids.
Hi.
It looks like an industrial.
Oh, I don't know. The fellow who gave it to him, ask Rick, he'll tell you. He said that the guy who gave it to him claims that they dropped it out of a flying disc. So, and then in which case that makes sense. It would be a spent piece of fuel, possibly.
So this 1115, what they're talking about, is it Moscovium or ununpentium?
Yeah,
Is it Moscovium or ununpentium?
Ununpentium. Yeah. Which is 115 in Latin. Right.
Because Russia and US scientists, they came together, they just created one called Moscovium.
Right, right.
Let's say it has the same element.
Right, nice. Yeah, it's an isotope.
That's very simple equation what they use.
Right. No. All right, any other questions? Nope. If you want to see this model, I mean, I'm a lousy model builder. I haven't built a model in 30 years, but there's a light inside, so you can see the little alien there. If you want to see it, would you come up here? I'd rather not pass it around so it doesn't get broken.
Is that functional?
I wish. All right, well, thank you, everybody.
Very good presentation.
Thank you very much.
Very